When I discovered that the person I trusted most desired the man I shared my life with, I didn't feel hatred or despair. I felt something more dangerous: lucidity. The betrayal revealed truths I'd been avoiding, about my marriage, about my friendships, and most importantly, about myself. Instead of reacting with scandal, I chose strategic silence. That's when I understood that losing naivety isn't losing strength, it's gaining vision. And with clarity, no one else decides for you anymore. If this story helps you understand that clarity is the greatest power, please like and subscribe. There are moments when betrayal arrives not as explosive revelation, but as quiet recognition. When you finally see patterns you've been unconsciously ignoring for months or years, when the pieces suddenly arrange themselves into picture so clear you wonder how you ever missed it. The discovery that my closest friend Elena had been systematically pursuing my husband didn't come through catching them together or through dramatic confession. It came through accumulated observations that finally formed undeniable pattern, through moment of lucidity where all the small strange behaviors and boundary violations I'd been rationalizing away suddenly made perfect, devastating sense. What surprised me about that moment wasn't the pain or the anger, though both were present. What surprised me was the clarity that came with finally seeing the truth. The way betrayal stripped away all the comfortable illusions I'd been maintaining about my marriage and my friendship, and about who I was in relationship to both. That clarity didn't lead me to tears or confrontations or desperate attempts to save what was being taken from me. It led me to strategic silence, to careful observation, to recognition that the betrayal had given me something valuable, even as it took something away. It had given me vision unclouded by trust or hope or denial, and with that vision came power to make choices based on reality rather than on what I wished were true. My name is Marina Alves, and I'm 34 years old. When this story begins, I'd been married to my husband Carlos for 7 years, and had been close friends with Elena for 6 of those years. We'd met through a professional women's group, had bonded over shared experiences as women building careers while managing personal relationships, had developed what I'd believed was genuine friendship built on mutual support and understanding. Elena was 32, worked in marketing, was beautiful and charismatic, and perpetually single despite what seemed like plenty of romantic opportunities. Carlos was 36, worked as an architect, was a good husband in many ways, though our marriage had its challenges like any long-term relationship. The pattern of my friendship with Elena had been that we shared everything: our professional struggles, our relationship challenges, our insecurities and fears and hopes. I'd confided in her about difficulties in my marriage, about periods when Carlos and I weren't connecting well, about frustrations and concerns I had about our relationship. She'd positioned herself as my confidant and supporter, someone I could trust with my most vulnerable feelings, someone who was genuinely invested in my well-being and my happiness. What I didn't see for years, what Elena had carefully concealed beneath performance of supportive friendship, was that she was using everything I shared with her to position herself as alternative to me, to subtly insert herself into my marriage, while I remained oblivious because I couldn't imagine someone I trusted so completely would deliberately work to take what was mine. The first hint that something was wrong came about 4 months before my moment of clarity. Small observation that individually seemed explainable, but that planted seed of doubt. I noticed that Elena had started showing up at places she knew Carlos would be: professional events he attended, the gym where he worked out, the coffee shop near his office where he often had morning meetings. When I'd mentioned seeing her at these places, she'd have reasonable explanations. She'd joined that gym because it was convenient. She'd been invited to that professional event by a colleague. She'd discovered that coffee shop and liked it. Each explanation was plausible, but the frequency of these coincidental encounters started to feel less random and more deliberate. I also noticed that Elena had become increasingly interested in Carlos's work and hobbies in ways that seemed unusual, given she'd never shown particular interest before. She'd ask detailed questions about his architectural projects, would research topics related to his work so she could have intelligent conversations about them, had taken up photography, which was one of Carlos's main hobbies. When I'd comment on her sudden interest in architecture and photography, she'd say she was expanding her horizons, exploring new interests, trying to be a more well-rounded person. Again, individually explainable, but collectively starting to form a pattern that troubled me. Most significantly, I started noticing subtle changes in how Elena talked to me about Carlos and about my marriage. Where she'd previously been supportive when I'd confide about relationship challenges, she'd started making comments that subtly undermined my marriage while seeming like friendly concern. Carlos seems really frustrated lately. Maybe he needs someone who understands his work better. Or, I noticed Carlos looking a bit distant at dinner last week. Are things okay between you two? The comments were framed as concern for my well-being, but they consistently planted suggestions that my marriage was in trouble, that Carlos was unhappy, that perhaps I wasn't meeting his needs adequately. The moment of clarity came on a Thursday evening when Carlos mentioned casually that he'd had lunch with Elena to discuss a potential collaboration. She'd approached him about doing architectural photography for her company's marketing materials. The mention was casual, presented as straightforward professional interaction, but something about it triggered all my accumulated observations into sudden sharp focus. I asked Carlos how Elena had known to approach him specifically for architectural photography when his photography hobby wasn't something he advertised professionally. He'd seemed slightly uncomfortable, had said that Elena had mentioned she was looking for an architect photographer, and he'd told her he did photography as hobby and might be interested. When I asked when this conversation had happened, he'd been vague. Sometime recently, he couldn't remember exactly when. Just casual conversation that had led to the lunch meeting. The vagueness was uncharacteristic for Carlos, who was usually precise about details. The discomfort in his manner suggested there was more to the story than straightforward professional collaboration. And suddenly, all the pieces arranged themselves into picture I could no longer avoid seeing. Elena's frequent presence at places Carlos frequented, her newfound interest in his work and hobbies, her subtle undermining of my marriage, her private communications with my husband about professional collaboration I'd known nothing about. All of it formed a clear pattern of someone systematically positioning herself to replace me. The recognition brought not tears or panic, but strange cold clarity. I could see with sudden perfect vision exactly what had been happening, could recognize patterns of manipulation and boundary violation I'd been unconsciously ignoring because I'd trusted Elena, and because acknowledging what she was doing would have required admitting that my closest friend was betraying me. The clarity extended beyond just Elena's behavior. It illuminated truths about my marriage I'd been avoiding, about ways Carlos had been participating in whatever was developing between him and Elena, even if he hadn't consciously recognized it as betrayal, about my own patterns of confiding outside my marriage rather than working directly on relationship issues. What I felt in that moment of clarity wasn't primarily anger or hurt, though both were present. What I felt was dangerous lucidity. Ability to see reality stripped of all the comfortable illusions and rationalizations I'd been maintaining. Recognition that I had choices and power I hadn't been exercising because I'd been operating based on trust and hope rather than on clear assessment of what was actually happening. My first instinct was to confront Elena and Carlos immediately, to demand explanations and confessions, to force the truth into open where it would have to be acknowledged and dealt with. But the clarity that had come with recognition suggested different approach. Strategic silence, careful observation, gathering of complete information before making any moves that would reveal I knew what was happening. I decided to watch and wait, to see how far Elena's campaign had progressed and how much Carlos was participating in it, to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before deciding how to respond. The decision required discipline and control I wasn't sure I possessed. Maintaining normal, friendly interaction with Elena while knowing she was working to take my husband, acting as if nothing was wrong with Carlos while watching his behavior for signs of deeper involvement with Elena. Over the following 2 weeks, I observed carefully while maintaining appearance of obliviousness. I noticed that Carlos and Elena were texting regularly, Carlos's phone would light up with messages from her several times a day, messages he'd read quickly, and sometimes respond to while seeming slightly furtive about the interaction. I noticed that Elena would find excuses to text me asking about Carlos's schedule or preferences, information gathering that seemed innocent, but that I now recognized as strategic collection of data about my husband's availability and interests. I also started paying attention to how Carlos talked about Elena, to whether he mentioned her more than seemed warranted by their supposed professional collaboration. He'd bring her up casually in conversation. Elena mentioned she's thinking about taking up running. Maybe I should suggest she join my running group. Or, Elena had interesting perspective on that architectural project I told you about. The mentions were frequent enough to suggest she was occupying significant space in his thoughts, that their interaction had progressed beyond occasional professional contact into something more regular and more personal. Most revealingly, I discovered through checking Carlos's email, something I'd never done before but that my newfound clarity justified, that he and Elena had been having lunches and coffee meetings regularly for at least 3 months, encounters neither of them had mentioned to me, private interactions that suggested relationship that had developed well beyond what either would characterize as casual professional acquaintance. The emails between them were carefully calibrated to stop short of anything explicitly inappropriate, no declarations of feelings or sexual content that would constitute clear evidence of affair. But the tone was intimate and familiar, full of private jokes and personal observations and level of emotional sharing that should have been reserved for our marriage. Carlos was confiding in Elena about his work frustrations, his personal concerns, his thoughts and feelings in ways he hadn't been sharing with me. Elena was positioning herself as person who understood him better than I did, who appreciated him more than I apparently did, who shared interests I didn't share, and who could provide emotional connection he was apparently not getting adequately in our marriage. The discovery confirmed what I'd already intuited. This wasn't full physical affair yet, but it was comprehensive emotional affair that was systematically replacing me as primary emotional partner in Carlos's life. Elena had successfully inserted herself into space that should have been occupied by spouse, had become person Carlos turned to for understanding and connection and validation. The fact that nothing physical had happened yet didn't make the betrayal less serious. In some ways, the emotional intimacy they'd developed was more threatening to my marriage than simple physical infidelity would have been. Armed with complete understanding of what was happening, I had to decide how to respond. The old Marina, the one who'd operated based on trust and hope, and who'd believed in direct communication and working through problems openly, would have confronted both of them immediately, would have demanded explanations and apologies and commitments to end their inappropriate relationship and rebuild trust. But the clarity that betrayal had given me suggested that approach was naive and would likely be ineffective. Direct confrontation would just drive their relationship underground, would give them opportunity to minimize what had happened and to make promises they might or might not keep, would put me in position of having to trust people who'd already demonstrated they were willing to betray that trust. The new Marina, the one who'd gained lucidity through betrayal and who could see reality without illusions, recognized that this situation required different approach. I needed to respond strategically rather than emotionally, needed to make decisions based on clear assessment of what I actually wanted and what was actually possible, rather than on what I wished were true or what I hoped could be salvaged. What I recognized through my clarity was that my marriage to Carlos had fundamental problems that Elena's interference had exposed but hadn't created. We'd been emotionally disconnected for years, had fallen into pattern where I confided my relationship concerns to Elena, rather than working on them directly with Carlos, where he'd been seeking emotional connection outside our marriage because he wasn't getting it adequately within our marriage. Elena had exploited these vulnerabilities rather than creating them. She'd seen cracks in our relationship and had systematically worked to widen them, but the cracks had been there before she'd started her campaign. I also recognized that my friendship with Elena had never been what I'd believed it was. She'd positioned herself as my confidant and supporter while actually using information I'd shared to undermine me. had performed loyalty while systematically working to take what was mine. The friendship I'd valued and trusted had been illusion, manipulation disguised as genuine connection. These recognitions led me to clarity about what I actually wanted. I wanted to end my friendship with Elena permanently and completely. Wanted to ensure she paid some price for her betrayal that would prevent her from doing the same thing to someone else. And I wanted to save my marriage to Carlos if possible, but only if he was willing to acknowledge what had happened and to do genuine work to rebuild what had been damaged. Only if the marriage we rebuilt would be based on actual emotional connection rather than on comfortable routine and unexamined patterns. The approach I decided on was strategic and calculated, designed to achieve these objectives while maintaining control over the situation rather than reacting emotionally in ways that would give Carlos and Elena power to shape the narrative or the outcome. First, I documented everything I'd discovered: screenshots of emails and text messages, records of Carlos and Elena's lunches and meetings, evidence of Elena's systematic campaign to insert herself into my marriage. I didn't plan to use this documentation publicly or to share it widely, but having comprehensive record gave me power and protection if either of them tried to deny or minimize what had happened. Second, I ended my friendship with Elena directly and completely, but I did it strategically rather than through dramatic confrontation. I called her and told her calmly that I knew about her relationship with Carlos, that I knew she'd been systematically working to undermine my marriage and position herself as alternative to me, that our friendship was over permanently and she should never contact me again. When she tried to deny or explain or justify, I cut her off. I'm not interested in your explanations or excuses. I know what you did and why you did it. This friendship is over. Do not contact me again. Then I ended the call and blocked her number and her email and all her social media. The approach denied Elena opportunity to manipulate or to perform remorse, denied her the dramatic confrontation she might have expected where she could attempt to justify her behavior or to turn situation to her advantage. It was clean ending that gave her no opening to continue contact or to attempt to salvage relationship that I had no interest in salvaging. Third, I confronted Carlos, but I did it from position of clarity and power, rather than from position of hurt and desperation. I told him I knew about his emotional affair with Elena, that I'd documented the extent of their relationship, that I was ending my friendship with Elena permanently. Then I gave him choice. We could end our marriage immediately with relatively amicable divorce, or we could attempt to save it through intensive marriage counseling and complete transparency about his relationship with Elena and about what had been missing in our marriage that had made him vulnerable to her interference. I'm not going to beg you to choose me over Elena, I told him. I'm not going to compete with her or try to prove I'm worthy of your loyalty. If you want to pursue relationship with her, you're free to do that. I'll file for divorce and we can both move on. If you want to save our marriage, we can try. But it will require you ending all contact with Elena permanently, being completely transparent with me about everything that happened between you, and doing serious work to understand why you developed emotional relationship with my best friend instead of working on problems in our marriage directly with me. Those are your options. Make your choice. The approach put Carlos in position of having to make active decision rather than allowing him to drift passively between me and Elena while avoiding accountability for what he'd done. It demonstrated that I had clarity about situation and about my own value, that I wasn't going to accept half measures or empty promises, that whatever happened next would be based on his genuine choice rather than on my desperate attempts to hold on to marriage he was already abandoning. Carlos chose to try to save our marriage. Whether that choice was motivated by genuine desire to rebuild our relationship, or by fear of consequences of divorce, or by recognition that what he had with Elena wasn't actually better than what he had with me, I didn't know and decided didn't particularly matter. What mattered was that he made choice and committed to requirements I'd set for attempting reconciliation. The months that followed were difficult and required maintaining the clarity that betrayal had given me, even when emotions threatened to overwhelm rational assessment of situation. We did intensive marriage counseling 3 times a week, sessions that forced both of us to confront how our marriage had deteriorated and what our respective roles had been in creating vulnerabilities Elena had exploited. Carlos had to acknowledge that he'd developed inappropriate emotional relationship with my best friend, that he'd confided in her in ways that violated our marriage, that he'd been participating in her campaign to undermine our relationship, even if he hadn't consciously recognized that's what he was doing. I had to acknowledge that I'd contributed to problems in our marriage through my pattern of confiding marital difficulties to Elena, rather than working on them directly with Carlos, through my lack of engagement with interests and concerns that mattered to him, through ways I'd allowed our emotional connection to atrophy while assuming the marriage was stable because we weren't actively fighting. The therapy was productive but also revealed uncomfortable truths about both of us and about patterns we'd fallen into. Carlos had been seeking validation and emotional connection outside our marriage because he felt I didn't appreciate him or engage with his interests adequately. I'd been confiding in Elena rather than in Carlos because I found it easier to complain about problems than to do difficult work of actually addressing them directly. We'd both been avoiding genuine emotional intimacy with each other while seeking easier, less challenging connections elsewhere. Carlos with Elena, me with friendship that turned out to be illusion. Working through these issues required both of us to change fundamental patterns and to rebuild emotional connection that had eroded over years of neglect. Carlos had to learn to bring his needs and concerns directly to me, rather than seeking understanding elsewhere. I had to learn to engage with his life and interests, rather than remaining passively uninvolved. We both had to learn to have difficult conversations directly, rather than avoiding conflict or seeking easier alternatives. The rebuilding process was slow and sometimes painful, but the clarity I'd gained through betrayal helped me navigate it from position of strength, rather than from position of desperation. I knew what I would and wouldn't accept, knew when Carlos was genuinely working on rebuilding versus when he was just going through motions, knew when to push for deeper work and when to acknowledge genuine progress. 6 months into the intensive therapy and rebuilding work, I discovered through mutual friend that Elena had started dating someone new, relationship that seemed serious and committed. The news brought complicated emotions, relief that she'd apparently moved on from pursuit of Carlos, residual anger about her betrayal, recognition that she'd face no real consequences for what she'd done beyond losing friendship she'd never truly valued, and brief period of not getting what she'd wanted before finding alternative. Part of me wanted her to pay more significant price for her systematic campaign to undermine my marriage and for her comprehensive betrayal of friendship I'd valued and trusted. But the clarity that had guided me through this entire process helped me recognize that my energy was better spent rebuilding my own marriage and my own life, rather than focused on ensuring Elena suffered adequately for what she'd done. Her consequences, losing access to Carlos and to me, having to live with knowledge that she'd spent over a year working to take what she'd wanted and had ultimately failed, were sufficient even if they weren't as dramatic or as punitive as part of me wished they could be. What mattered more was that betrayal had given me gift of clarity, had forced me to see truths about my marriage and my friendship and myself that I'd been avoiding, had stripped away comfortable illusions and required me to engage with reality as it actually was rather than as I wished it were. That clarity had been painful to gain but was ultimately valuable. It had given me power to make decisions based on truth rather than on hope or denial, had enabled me to respond strategically rather than just emotionally, had helped me rebuild marriage on more honest foundation rather than on patterns of avoidance and disconnection that had made it vulnerable to Elena's interference. 2 years after discovering Elena's betrayal, and after choosing strategic clarity over emotional reaction, I'm 36, and my marriage to Carlos is stronger and more authentic than it's ever been. We worked through fundamental issues that had created vulnerabilities in our relationship, rebuilt emotional connection that had eroded over years, created patterns of direct communication and genuine engagement that replaced avoidance and seeking easier connections elsewhere. The marriage we have now is based on reality rather than on illusions, on active choice rather than on comfortable routine, on actual intimacy rather than on performance of partnership while being emotionally disconnected. Elena, from what I hear occasionally through remaining mutual acquaintances, has built life that apparently doesn't include acknowledgement of or remorse for what she did. She's in serious relationship, has continued her career, seems to have moved on completely from her campaign to take my husband. Whether she learned anything from the experience, or whether she sees it as merely failed attempt that she's moved past, I don't know and have stopped caring about. She's no longer part of my life or my thoughts, except as cautionary reminder about trust, and about recognizing when someone's performance of friendship is concealing something more selfish and more destructive. What I learned from Elena's betrayal and from the clarity it forced on me is that losing naivety isn't losing strength. It's gaining vision that enables you to see reality clearly and to make decisions based on truth rather than on comfortable illusions. The lucidity that came from finally recognizing what Elena was doing and what my marriage had become was painful, but powerful. It stripped away all the rationalizations and denials I'd been maintaining, forced me to see patterns I'd been unconsciously ignoring, gave me information and perspective I needed to make strategic choices rather than just emotional reactions. The strategic silence I chose instead of dramatic confrontation allowed me to gather complete information, to understand full scope of what I was dealing with, to respond from position of power rather than from position of hurt and desperation. The clarity about what I actually wanted, to end toxic friendship permanently, to save marriage only if genuine rebuilding was possible, gave me framework for making decisions that served my actual interests rather than just reacting to immediate emotional pain. The betrayal didn't break me because I chose to use the clarity it provided rather than being overwhelmed by the pain it caused. I chose strategic response over emotional reaction, chose to see the gift of vision, even while acknowledging the cost of what I'd lost, chose to rebuild based on truth, rather than trying to restore illusions that betrayal had shattered. Some betrayals destroy you because they reveal truths you can't handle, or because they shatter foundations you can't rebuild. This betrayal gave me clarity, dangerous lucidity that enabled me to see my marriage and my friendship and myself without illusions, power to make choices based on reality rather than on hope or denial, vision that nobody else could take away once I'd gained it. And with that clarity, with that vision, nobody else got to decide for me anymore. I decided based on clear assessment of what was real and what I wanted and what was possible. The betrayal didn't break me. It gave me the most valuable thing I'd never known I was missing, the ability to see clearly and to choose accordingly. My name is Marina Alves. When I discovered my closest friend was systematically working to take my husband, I didn't feel hatred or despair. I felt lucidity. The betrayal revealed truths I'd been avoiding about my marriage, my friendship, myself. Instead of dramatic confrontation, I chose strategic silence and careful observation. I ended the toxic friendship completely, gave my husband clear choice about whether to rebuild our marriage under new terms, used the clarity betrayal provided to make decisions based on reality rather than illusions. Losing naivety wasn't losing strength. It was gaining vision. And with that vision, with that dangerous clarity, I took back power over my own story and my own choices. The betrayal didn't break me. It gave me the clarity to see what needed to change, and the strength to change it. Thank you for reading. If this story helps you understand that clarity is the greatest power, please like and subscribe.